of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, thank you, Public and International Affairs in New York. As we will not have time for a more detailed introduction, please see their bios on the website under SDG 16. I'll now turn the time over to Mr. Felipe Queipo. Thank you.
Thank you. How are you doing? Good. Really? Okay, let's try again. How are you doing? Awesome. We just had lunch and it's kind of like hard. My name is Felipe, and again, bios on the website, so just you can get bored there. We're here to talk about SDG 16, Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions, and we're here to hopefully have a nice conversation with you and facilitate with this wonderful panel. I'm just here to pretend that I'm doing something. My colleagues at the UN are here, so I was like, okay, let's see that I'm working at least, doing something, not just visiting Utah. But the idea is to review why SDG 16 is important, why it matters, of course, why peace, justice, and strong institutions, but mostly peace and justice, are misunderstood, and how we can really address certain issues related to them. And as you know, you may know, the Sustainable Development Goals have not only 17 target objectives, like goals, but also 169 targets and different indicators. That's a lot of information. Let me introduce you two concepts: peace and security from the UN perspective. What is that when we talk about peace, what do we mean by peace? And when we talk about justice, what do we mean by justice? And I think peace is easier in that, I think since 1945, when the UN was created, peace meant something very specific. I'm not getting bombed at or shot at. Okay, I'm at peace. I'm not at war, so peace is okay. I'm not in conflict. Definition of 1945 does not apply to 2022. The UN has been able, through the last 77 years, of redefining the concept of peace. And we now talk about peace that is inclusive of certain rights: access to clean water and sanitation, peace of being able to express myself freely, not being persecuted because of my sexual orientation, because of my faith tradition, because of my political affiliation. Peace means that I have access to shelter, that I have a job. Peace is quality of life. And the UN has been working for 77 years to do that, to redefine that concept and say, listen, peace is much more. People deserve much more than not being at peril constantly. People deserve quality of life. So that evolution of the definition has come with different responsibilities, and one of them is interacting with other entities outside of the UN. Justice is more complex. You can have laws, and sometimes people relate justice with judicial system, and is a mistake. It can, in certain countries, to be gay is illegal, and you will be persecuted and sometimes even put to death. There's death penalty for people who identify of a sexual orientation that is not the norm in those countries. In certain countries, women don't have certain rights. That is legal. Is it just? What is the definition of justice then when it compares to law? And what is the definition of justice then when it relates to civil engagement or civic space? So I think that with those two concepts, the panel is in an amazing position to explain what they do for a living, why these two items matter, and how institutions that are really aligned with certain principles within the UN system, but also abroad, why they're so fundamental to be able to achieve certain quality of life and certain standards for everyone globally. So I just really spoke a lot. I'm going to let me ask Kim first to give her presentation and talk a little bit about how this relates to her space.
Thanks, Felipe. So I'm Kim Sadique, and as they mentioned at the beginning, I'm head of Community and Criminal Justice Division at Montefort University, which is actually one of the UN academic impact hubs. My work has been very much around genocide education and preventing violence and mass atrocities. And I had written the presentation for today, which I have since ripped up, because it was actually mentioned this morning that sometimes it can be really quick that peace is destroyed. And my university is based in Leicester in the UK, and we have had 50 years of I would say, harmony between communities of all different ethnic backgrounds and faith backgrounds. And in the last month and a half, we have seen that crash and burn into riots, criminal damage, public violence, and other public order offences. And for me, living in somewhere like Leicester, which has always been very open and very harmonious, I started to have a look at why some of those things were happening and why it descended so quickly. The initial kind of newspaper reports were actually that it was caused by an India versus Pakistan cricket match in Dubai. Obviously, this has now been proved not to have been the case. But what we saw was actually, and this is a really key thing, I think, in terms of the UN SDG and the links between why it really matters, and it's that global can impact on national and local, and very, very quickly, particularly through the use of social media. So what we saw was very early on information coming out initially via social media and then via international media that far-right movements, the Hindutva in India, their messages were starting to seep into the UK. We then had a legislator from the BJP party in India arrested probably about 6 days before the match took place, the cricket match took place, and which is why I think people tied those two things so closely together. But he was arrested for making derogatory comments about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And this triggered people in Leicester seeing this happening online. And like I said, within 6 days, what we then saw was plummeting into street fighting, which then became mass riots and protests. We were then having people shipped in through the use of social media again, putting out negative messages against both communities, bringing in extra people from surrounding areas to join in the riots. And so that for me was a real shock, that it could happen quite so quickly in a matter of days and last so long. And we're now starting to see it spread across other areas in the UK as well. But I think the key things around peace, justice and strong institutions is that we need to think about the response to that. The policing response was slow, and that's not to blame the police for that. Obviously, it's international news that our monarch had passed away, so many of our police officers had actually been sent to London to manage the funeral and the issues happening in London. But it was also about community leaders. What we were finding was that a lot of community leaders who were self-appointed in general, they weren't grassroots activists, they weren't people who had the ear to the ground in the community, were the ones making the statements. And actually, one of the key things I think is really important to take away from this, it was a comment from, only together can we make the change we need, and it's about making action happen. And that often happens at the grassroots. The problem, I think, for the UK was that actually the platform on which this was allowed to happen was that politically we've seen a much more far-right kind of view of politics at the moment, with our Home Secretary, our previous Home Secretary and our current Home Secretary very much interested in blocking immigration into the country, issues around refugee status in our country. But my work and the kind of empirical basis for the arguments that I'm making is around education. You know, the role of the university in educating individuals is absolutely vital. And it's not just about theory and policy. You know, a lot of universities will deliver that kind of message. But actually what we know is that teaching action, skilling people and giving people confidence to take action, to stand up, speak out and challenge hatred in all of its forms is the only way we can really go. And on top of that, it's about not just people who will take action in the short term, but one of the key things, obviously the S in SDG, is about sustainability. And what we've been doing is working on a programme called Building Stronger Communities, where we actually educate people through the use of survivor testimony from genocides around the world, and we show them what micro actions they can take to stand up in their local communities. By the end of the 6-week programme, we then make them, ask them, I should probably say, to undertake a sustainable pledge. And then we would check back in with them routinely to make sure that they are actually undertaking those pledges. And it might be as simple as educating others. It might be as simple as taking on some community work, working with refugees. But any which way that they are able to stand up and take action. And we can start to see that manifesting itself now in Leicester in terms of responding to the violence and community tensions that we've had. So 2 key things here. We cannot be complacent. You know, Leicester has a history, like I say, 50 years plus of harmony. We didn't see this coming. So the second thing is we must be vigilant and actually have people in communities who can see these things happen and who feel comfortable enough to report. Because only together can we make the change that we need. Thank you.
Much, Kim. And Maggie, I'm going to give you the floor now.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for organizing this, and thank you to these fantastic panelists. I don't belong here. I wish I had ripped mine to shreds earlier, but I appreciate folks being patient with me and for being here again. As folks said, my name is Maggie. I work for RBIJ, which stands for the Responsible Business Initiative for Justice. I'm going to read to you what we do, and then I'm going to explain that a little bit more because it's going to sound like a lot of jargon. What we are an international nonprofit organization working with companies to champion fairness, equality, and effectiveness across systems of justice, and to advance economic mobility and opportunity for systems-impacted people, all while working in consultation with community members and campaign organizations. So what does all of that mean? How is that connected to the SDGs? First and foremost, we are an international organization, as I said, but a lot of our work is focused on the American criminal justice system, in large part because there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. Thankfully, the SDGs are now universal, and a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today applies to our justice system here. We, of course, at RBIJ work tirelessly to connect poverty to justice, as the SDGs aim to do, but I think the part that I wanted to speak to today about our work, the crux of it, is about businesses. As folks probably know, the SDGs were created in conjunction with citizens, civic society, and businesses, with the idea being that ambition sort of means that you have to sort of very much collaborate across societies, and including with the private sector. So what we do, all that stuff aside, we work with businesses. We work with them in justice reform work, and we have issues like juvenile sentencing, the death penalty, bail reform, clean slate legislation, fair chance hiring, and so on. We do that because we believe that adding new people to the table widens the opportunity for impact. And we've also seen, for better or for worse, that when businesses speak, legislators do in fact listen to them. So I was asked to speak a little bit today about the death penalty and our work on that and how businesses have a role to play in ending the death penalty. So I'm going to try to do just that pretty quickly. The one thing that I want to speak out quickly is just that we have a global campaign called the Business Leaders Against the Death Penalty Campaign. It was launched in March of 2021 with Sir Richard Branson and has top executive names that you all would recognize: Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook, Alan Jope from Unilever, and so on. And these are sort of recognizable names saying that they want the death penalty to end. And it might seem strange to you that a business leader would be calling for an end to this, but I'm going to tell you why in a minute. But one thing that I will say is we are now closer to almost 300 business leaders, big names who sort of are saying this thing should end. But the reason I was excited to talk about this here in Utah is because, as folks probably know, or maybe you aren't aware, Utah still has the death penalty on the books. And so I actually was here this time last year. I'm grateful to be here in the fall. It seems like the best time to be in Utah. And I met with business leaders and talked to them about the death penalty and asked, are you aware of this? Do you care about this? Why or why not? And let them know that there's going to be a death penalty bill last year. So in January, that bill was introduced. It was called HB 147. And it had widespread support in a way that felt very unusual for a bill like this. There were conservative lawmakers leading it. There were current and former prosecutors in support of it. There were folks sort of stepping out of the woodwork, including victims' families, and saying, we don't want the death penalty to exist here in Utah anymore. And that was really interesting. Our role is obviously to sort of help educate the business voice and sort of say, if we can help you as you lead a social media campaign, if we can help you in a press conference, if we can help you do any of this work, we will help do that. But people were really interested in working on this issue, which again felt a little surprising to me. So folks always ask, why do businesses care about ending the death penalty? It feels like a bit of a stretch. There are some issues that have the clear economic case. And we found, I wanted to share a couple of the answers that I got from folks in Utah about this. And then I promise I will pause and share the mic here. But one thing that we heard over and over again is this idea of waste. So I'm going to read you some stats here, so bear with me. For the last 20 years in Utah, the state has spent roughly $40 million on death penalty cases, and that has only funded 2 sentences. So for 2 decades, it's only funded 2 sentences. That's taxpayer money. So when you talk to a business, it's actually not a stretch to say there's not really a business case for this. And business leaders are very practical people, and they'll say, that's bad business. It doesn't really make sense. The second thing that I will say is around innocence, which is the unsurprising one. But I will say that business leaders in particular, you might say that feels like a stretch, but businesses obviously are made up of people. Business leaders are human beings, and the innocence case is really important to them. So I'm going to read you a stat about that too. Since the 1970s, at least 186 people have been exonerated and freed from death row nationwide. That means that for every 8 people executed, 1 innocent person is released, that we know of. For folks who might remember, in Utah, actually in 2004, Bruce Goodman was proved innocent after spending almost 2 decades in prison for a crime he did not commit. DNA evidence proves that that was the case. And so when I talk to business leaders, they sort of say, my gosh, we can't keep having something on the books if there's a real case of killing innocent people accidentally. And the last thing that I will speak to, and then I will pause, is about foreign trade and investment. And I think that's pretty applicable to Utah. So folks here probably know that Utah, you are a very global economy. We're at a conference led by the UN. And European countries in particular have a lot of investment in trade here in Utah. And you all really pride yourself in doing that. But there are a lot of European countries in particular, but also countries across the globe that have said, we don't want to support a country or a state that supports the death penalty and still has it in practice. And so I think one thing that when we talk to business leaders about, particularly when it comes to folks in Salt Lake, folks who really do foreign and trade missions, they're a bit afraid that the reputation of this will sort of stay in Utah, which is a real unfortunate thing. And so we talked to a lot of business leaders about how, yeah, we're hearing that from trade missions, that folks don't want to put their money behind that. So I come from a very, very niche sector, the private sector, talking about these issues. But I'll just end by saying that I mentioned the death penalty is still in the books here in Utah. There was a bill, it did not move forward. But I actually remain really optimistic about the fact that it will probably pass in the coming years at some point. And I think that the private sector, I think that businesses, because they have the power and the money and the influence, have the opportunity to sort of help shift that and move the needle. And so I hope that that happens. Thanks.
Thank you, Maggie. And before I give you the floor, my brain is a little bit slow, so I was processing what Kim and what Maggie were saying, but I'm fascinated about something is the connection that exists between law enforcement and keeping the peace, or the role that law enforcement has in maintaining the peace, or sometimes, in many cases, or in some cases, disturbing it, or contributing to the problem more than really addressing the solution. And then we hear nowadays about police reform and defund the police in the U.S. particularly, and it will be interesting to know a little bit afterwards, after Ryan, what your take on that is. But I think that Maggie's point on the intersection between private sector, civil society, and government interests is fascinating because, again, there's not always a connection that we can easily make. It's not something that we can identify immediately, and yet it has a huge impact in all sectors at the same time, and eventually it just trickles down to the individual and the rights of the individual, but also as a society, but also as an individual. So I would love to talk a little bit more about that afterwards. But of course now we have Ryan Koch, and he's always fun to listen to, I have to admit. And I don't know, are we hearing anything about Cerulean Blue today or not?
No.
Not today? Okay. I'll tell you the story afterwards. But Ryan, the floor is yours.
So I want to thank everybody for coming today. I want to thank Felipe for organizing the panel. And I actually had to laugh thinking about my co-presenters because if you notice, we had peace and justice, and I'm going to be speaking about strong institutions. And it actually wasn't planned that way, but it makes sense. And the other thing that I think is also interesting is I'm sitting here looking at the Goal 16 box, and the way that it's translated into other languages is effective institutions versus strong institutions. And I'm actually going to be speaking more about the effective institutions versus the strong institutions. So in my intro, they told you all that I'm the Director of the New York Office of Public and International Affairs for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Try fitting all that on a business card. I actually have some. It does fit. But prior to working for the church, I was actually a Foreign Service officer. So I worked for the State Department for just over 11 years. And I'm actually going to talk a lot about my experience as a State Department guy versus my current role. I need to give you a little bit of background. So the State Department, what we do is we staff the embassies around the world. And so much like the military moves from place to place, from base to base, I moved from embassy to embassy. So I worked in the Philippines, I worked in Ukraine, and I worked in Stockholm as a Foreign Service officer. Within the embassy, there are a number of different sections. There's the economic section that deals with economic affairs. There's the consular section that deals with visas and citizen services. If you were to get mugged in a foreign country, you would go to the consular section. They would help you out. Management section runs the embassy. I was a public diplomacy officer, which meant that I worked with the masses. Anything that you can think of that goes to the masses. Education, religion, media, social media, anything that went to the masses came through my office. And then you have the political section, which is what you think of when you think of a diplomat. So you think of the guy in the suit carrying the briefcase, rushing off to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That's the political section. And in my time at the State Department, I learned that there was an inherent tension, especially between public diplomacy and the State Department, and the political section, excuse me. They thought that we were a joke, that all we did was go to parties and we never did anything substantive. And we thought that they were pretty egotistical for being little more than glorified mailmen. But, friendly rivalry, right? No, what they did was very important, but what we did was also very important. And after working for the State Department for a few years, I came across this quote from Joseph Nye. Joseph Nye, he served in many positions throughout the government: Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Assistant Secretary of Defense, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, the list goes on and on. He was an amazing man. But he wrote an article about soft diplomacy, and he says this. He says, good public diplomacy has to go beyond propaganda. Nor is public diplomacy merely public relations campaigns. Conveying information and selling a positive image is part of it, but public diplomacy also involves building long-term relationships that create an enabling environment for government policies. So in other words, the role of the public diplomacy officer was to create public support for initiatives that the political guys could then go lobby the MFA for, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and say, you need to make this change, there's public support for it, and so then those changes could happen, okay? Because the two go hand in hand. You need public support for the institutional changes. So any effort to and strong or effective institutions like governments needs to have the inclusion of the population, the input of the population, and the buy-in from the population. And if it does not, no matter how good that policy is, it will never do anything to improve society. So let me give you a couple practical examples from my career. One of the places that I was in was Ukraine. And I served in Ukraine from 2006 to 2008. So it was a few years after the Orange Revolution, a few years before it got really bad again. It was the perfect time to be in that country. There was a lot of foreign direct investment coming in. We got a lot of money to do a lot of programs. But one of the smaller but more interesting programs that I was involved in was an access to information program. We would approach public libraries throughout the country, and we would say, all right, let's start a partnership. We will give you 2 years of internet access and all the equipment to set up an internet center. You give us the space and an administrator, and then you make sure that that's free to everybody for 2 years. After that, you can charge people, you can do whatever you want, but for the next 2 years it has to be free. We're paying for the internet, we're paying for the equipment. And it was fascinating for me to go around the country and open these centers. Many people had never even seen a computer before, let alone the internet. And for them to all of a sudden have access to everything I literally saw people in tears just as they were exploring what they could find out, what they could know. But when I've been thinking about it, I'm like, but if the people in that town never knew that this internet center existed, it does little good for them, right? You have to have that awareness among the population. You have to have the knowledge of what they can achieve and what they can rely on from their governments. And if you don't have that, then who cares if we set up this internet center? Taking it out to a little bit more macro level, talking about elections. In Ukraine, I was also an election observer for one of their elections, and that was a fascinating experience. I was in Western Ukraine. I had to go to a couple different polling places, make sure that everything was being done properly, that the ballots were being counted properly, etc. And I don't know how much you know about the history of Ukrainian elections, but especially at that time, it was super crazy. The election that sparked the Orange Revolution, like, the opposition was literally putting disappearing ink in the pens at the polling places so that they would vote, the ink would disappear, and then when they were counting it, they could change that vote. The main pro-Western candidate was literally poisoned by his opposition guy. So it was kind of the wild, wild west when it comes to democratic elections. And so we had a big team of observers to observe this election when I was there. And what they wanted was they wanted it to be labeled free and fair. That meant that the election protocols were in place. That meant we could depend and we could rely on the outcome of that election, and we could trust it, right? And if I recall correctly, that election was labeled free and fair. At least what I observed was free and fair. But what it really was doing was it was giving the population the buy-in for the election, so that the population trusted the election by having that label as free and fair. And so I think it will be interesting to see what happens in the United States going forward. Most of the tactics used to dispute the validity of the last election have been tactics aimed at the population. It will be interesting, it's long been taken for granted that our elections in the United States have been free and fair. And the recounts in the disputed states from this last election support that. But public sentiment has been undermined. And although we've always had election observers in the United States as well, none of the population actually knows that. This last election in 2020, we had a team of 500 from the OSCE in the United States observing our elections and, saying if it was free or fair or not, which they did, say that it was free and fair. And so going forward, it'll be interesting to see if we as a population need to rely on that status more in order to have that faith in the electoral process. I'll skip ahead. I just want to transition to my current role right now. In the United States, and not just in the United States, in many countries around the world, there are a number of polarizing issues, and that also undermines the strong and the effectiveness of the institutions, right? You get one party in power that makes a lot of policy changes, but because it's so polarized, the next party comes into power, and all they want to do is strike down everything that the other party did. So they strike down everything the other party did, and then the next party comes into power, and they just want to strike down everything. It's not a building up your society game, it's a destroying what the other person did game. And so one of the things that we've done in our office to try to bridge that divide and let's say, okay, how can we come together on common ground, is by focusing on human dignity. So in the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So if we want freedom, justice, and peace in the world, we have to recognize the dignity of our fellow human beings. It's one of the reasons, actually, why I love working with the United Nations so much, is because I do believe that, by and large, the people that work with the United Nations, whether it's staff, whether it's diplomats, whether it's the civil society side, We are doing it for altruistic reasons. As cheesy as it sounds, we really just want world peace. So, not a Devil Wears Prada quote, but a miscongeniality quote. But because we're doing it for altruistic reasons, we recognize that even though this person's worldview may be vastly different from mine, I recognize the dignity in that person, I recognize the purity of their motives, and we can work together. We can find some common ground. And if you come to my panel tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, we're going to be talking about finding common ground. I just want to conclude with the theme of this conference is why it matters, right? The United Nations and the work of the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals are far more well-known outside of the United States than they are inside the United States. Part of that is because the United Nations plays more of a role in the politics and the daily lives of people outside the U.S. than they do here. We are a superpower in the United States. We don't need the United Nations to have a voice, but a lot of other countries do. But the Sustainable Development Goals are what's going to drive the global work for the next 10 years, until 2030, or the next 8 years, I guess, when we know. The Sustainable Development Goals are what we can rally behind to improve the lives of every single person on this planet. They matter. And so we need conferences like this to help spread the word to the population and get that popular support for the work. Because without that popular support, no matter what we do, it's not going to go anywhere. Thank you.
Miscongeniality is okay. No, English for thank you. And it's just, Ryan and I have known each other for a long, long time, and we work a lot together. And I pay him well. You can tell that he loves the UN, right? So we do a good job. Before I want to open the floor for questions, but I want to talk about one concept that I think is extremely important. We've talked about the role of institutions, peace, security. We had talked about private sector. We had talked about civil society, government officials, former government officials, and ecclesiastical institutions, and the role of the United Nations. I disagree with you that the U.S. does not need the UN to. Sorry, everyone is.
The population doesn't know that.
Okay.
We need the UN.
Okay, good. You see, I live in Harlem. Harlem in New York City is a beautiful place, and people ask me all the time, well, what is the UN for me? What is the UN doing for me in Harlem? Why does it matter? Why does the UN matter to me, and why do the SDGs matter to me? And I say, well, how long do you have? Because I have plenty of time to tell you that when you use your cell phones, for example, the satellites, the orbits of the satellites are determined by the International Telecommunications Unit of the UN. Something as simple as that. When you use your passports, the biometrics determined by the International Civil Aviation Administration of Montreal, and so on. So we are engaged. Why? We want world peace. We want that peace that looks very different to what it looked in 1945. We want the peace that is inclusive, that provides the opportunities for everyone, and that provides space, a safe space for everyone. I was talking about law enforcement and civil society working with the private sector. Ecclesiastical institutions religious institutions are key. I was saying before, they've been doing the work that the UN has been trying to do for 77 years, together with our partners, for thousands of years. So strong institutions include faith traditions that have been trying to improve the quality of life across the world for a long time. My question for the panel, and it's the only question I promise I will ask, and then you can ask the questions, is, and by the way, in Spanish is solid institutions, so it's a new definition. As you, from your perspectives, what is the role that academia, in specific this academic conference, what is the role that academia can play in changing narratives, changing perspectives, and changing perceptions on the role that each one has to play? For example, what should academia tell the private sector should invest in? What should academia tell maybe law enforcement or different institutions? And what should academia learn or teach or share or explore with religious institutions that we can do to improve our services or the way we engage with people to accomplish the goals that we have? Maggie, do you mind?
Yeah, sure. Mine's going to be, I think, short and sweet, which is just to say the thing that I would really encourage academia to make sure that their students and that their conversations about is just the idea that businesses hold a lot of power, and we should all be holding them to that standard. I think that corporations in particular, but small businesses too, when we work in small places in Ohio or Colorado, there's a pickle shop in Colorado that had an enormous influence on a bill that just recently passed. There is a hot chicken place in Ohio that had an enormous presence and a reason why a bill passed in Ohio. And so what I would say is that, obviously there are individuals behind that, but I would say that businesses hold a lot of power, and we should be really tapping into them in really creative ways. And so I'd encourage everybody to figure out who owns the small business around the corner, and also the sort of larger one as well, and tap into those, because I think that they're really, really untapped power. Yeah.
Thank you. Kim?
I suppose for me it's academia and the role we play. I think there are some key things. Firstly, obviously, undertaking the research. And I don't just mean the big research grants that come in, but actually undertaking research for the small businesses, for religious institutions, for community activist groups. I think that makes a change in communities, and it's that kind of grassroots level of change that we need to see. You mentioned about police reform. In the UK right now, universities are absolutely central to police education. So actually up until March next year, what we call the IPPL-DIP, so the Initial Police Learning and Development Programme, is still allowed to happen, and that's in-house training by individual police forces. They're meant to be called police services now, but they still call their headquarters force headquarters, so that tells you something about how they view themselves, maybe. But my university and a number of other universities across the UK have now spent the last sort of 5 or 6 years working with the College of Policing to actually bring about education in academic institutions for policing students. So they are officers who are student officers paid for by their local police service to come to academic institutions to learn. The reason that that is important is because it's not in-house taught. We are not creating like for like. We are giving them the skills and the ability to critically think, to challenge things, to underpin a lot of police practice with lived experience. So we will hear from lots of people who've been involved in things like stop and search, for instance, who have had a negative experience. So actually the role of academia in particularly UN SDG 16 and particularly in police reform is about making sure that our police officers have a much more broader education and are able to critically think and challenge the system. Some of the work I've been doing actually in genocide education has impacted on the way we think about police education as well. Having taken some students, a number of policing and criminal investigation students as well, to places like Auschwitz and to Srebrenica in Bosnia. The thing that kept going round in my head was how easy it is when we put on that uniform or we take on our institution's belief structures and internal language, that thing that makes that institution a particular being, how easy it is to not challenge. And so one of the things for me was actually, how do we use understanding from broader concepts around genocide education to actually inform our students to stand up, speak out and challenge, and to have the courage to do so. And I think that has been quite an important part of developing our education programmes, is that pulling away, giving people the chance to challenge the uniform they're wearing. Because what we had seen in police education in the UK is a replication of what had gone before. Misogyny is still rife. Yeah. There are still issues internally and externally between the police service and minority communities. And so what academia can do is start to change those narratives and educate future officers.
Thank you. Right?
So there's a couple of things. One thing that I think is interesting is that academia has started doing more research into the role of religion in the lives of people. So you asked me specifically to talk about religion. So for example, with business, there's a researcher out of Maryland who does a lot of research onto how freedom of religion and belief practices are good business. Companies that respect freedom of religion or belief actually make more money, et cetera. And so doing some of those studies garner support for some of these institutions, I think would be good and interesting. But more than that, and beyond, broader than just with the religion focus, I think that the biggest thing that academic institutions have done and continue to do is teach people how to think. One of the beefs that I have with the current hate about Facebook is that Mark Zuckerberg is getting all of this like flack for the spread of disinformation on Facebook. And I think, why is it Mark Zuckerberg's fault that people have forgotten to be critical thinkers, right? That people have forgotten to check sources, that people have forgotten to, you know, think about what they're consuming. That's not Mark Zuckerberg's fault. That is us as a society's fault, that we are not willing to do that. And that's what academic institutions teach us to do, is to check our sources, is to, you know, fact check our claims, to support what we're doing and consuming. And so I think that's really the biggest thing that academic institutions can do.
And I think that I want to tie it back to the UN, which is the communication component. At all levels, in all scenarios, is the communication and the effective communication that happens, because quality listening precedes quality speaking. And how much we need to learn and gather information before we can issue ideas that we can really contribute to the conversation. It's a matter of really listening, engaging, getting a sense of what people are doing, and then contributing positively so we can build together and not so much start to destroy because we have the right side and the wrong side, or we have the right religion or the wrong religion, or law enforcement is bad or good, or the private sector is making too much money so they're desensitized to real issues. And that is not the case. I think that in all these cases, the common thread is humanity trying to do the best for humanity. And ideally, we can find the common grounds for all that. Thank you. We want to open the floor for any questions. I believe that there's a microphone over there. A little bit of exercise. We have it easy. Sorry, guys. And I hope it works. Sometimes, if it doesn't work, you let me know and I can just get mine.
If it doesn't work, just repeat the question.
Okay, if I can hear it, yes. Perfect. My microphone doesn't work? Yeah, bro. Does it work? This one? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Hello.
Okay, speak loud.
I'll just speak loud. I can project. Or I'll whisper into this. Perfect. Hi. Okay. Thank you all for being here. My name is Mohan. I'm a Salt Lake City native, run a healthcare company just out of Salt Lake City, and had a small stint at Oxford where I studied international humanitarian law, so love what you all are doing. And I have a question kind of regarding the role of technology in some of these various sectors. So, you know, from the perspective of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the Geneva Conventions and all of these things that we share values with, they arguably don't apply to a lot of modern technology and how the world conducts itself. I mean, like, even in the most basic sense of, like, drone warfare. And so as we continue to advance, I'm wondering what your perspectives are on trying to keep up these sacred documents with the advancement of technology and how we can implement these things in a more effective way to keep up with technology. But then subsequently, when we're talking about the fidelity of elections and security of elections, the implementation of advanced technology like blockchain or Web3 is also a solution to a lot of this stuff. And so it's kind of like a two-sided dichotomy of how do we keep up with the tech, and then are these institutions even ready to adopt the tech because the solution already exists? So I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Oh, no tap at all. So thank you. And you know, you got me when you said Geneva Conventions in plural. People use singular. Thank you. Thank you. So, there you are. I'm going to stay here so I can pass the mic. Who wants to take the question on technology? And oh, don't be shy.
Say about that. So, I'm going to quote one of the guys from the Department of Global Communications. His name is Mr. Felipe Queipo. So I'm going to go back to the foundation of the United Nations. The United Nations was founded after World War II, right? You see that all throughout the United Nations. For example, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are Great Britain, the United States, France, China, and Russia, okay? And why those 5? Because they won World War II, right? So Germany's not on there, Italy's not on there, and Japan's not on there because they lost. And at the foundation of the United Nations, the purpose, the mission of the United Nations was very clear, right? And as it's gone on, and as people have developed and technology has developed, it's like, well, why do we have this United Nations now? We need to figure out this purpose, right? And especially when you look at the conflicts that are existing in the Security Council right now, especially with Russia, China, and the United States, like, is that even going to ever be effective, right? And so UN reform is a big, major thing all the time, right? Figuring out how that works. But really, a lot of what they're fighting against now is ideologies and the spread of all ideologies. And they are taking into account technology in a lot of ways. Taking it back to the UN, one of the big campaigns of the Department of Global Communications is really just a campaign about fact-checking, about think before you repost, et cetera. And they're trying to encourage people to do that. As far as like Geneva Conventions and drones and all that technology is concerned, I do think that we do need to take those things into consideration, but the principles of the UDHR, the principles of the Geneva Convention, et cetera, those principles stay the same, and we just have to figure out how to apply it, right? So it's not like the UDHR is obsolete. It's not in any way, shape, or form, but how do we apply those principles to today's technology? And that's why we have conversations like this and conferences like this, is to figure that out.
Thank you. I'm still trying to convince Ryan to join the UN and our department. He's a great advocate for us. Let me just share one thing. Part of the work that we do in the department is engage with faith-based traditions and faith-based organizations. And there's an ethical component in the use of drones and unmanned equipment, satellite, whatever it is, if it be a drone or be it an unmanned like land drone also. When you dehumanize the component, when you allow for something else to have control over something that is supposed to have an emotion behind, which emotions are key in conflict, because emotions are the ones that lead to peace for the most part. It is the emotion of hope and faith in many cases that really drives individuals and drives organizations to really do what they do to bring sustainable peace in a way. We were talking about conflict and reconciliation, and how do you engage post-conflict two communities, the victims of a crime and the perpetrators of a crime, that they need to coexist together if you don't have emotions involved, if you don't have the humanity component. So the moment you dehumanize any aspect of our social life, you're making the mistake of giving it to chance or artificial intelligence, whatever you want to call it, to make decisions on behalf of humans that will impact humans. I think that is a very dangerous road for me personally. And as a man of faith, and I am someone who my faith informs me to become better, I think that we need to really reconsider how we are planning this society and the role that we want to give the different institutions, be it religious, be it civil society, academic, or the UN, into how we play these games that we call live, or how we really engage with each other. So, yeah, we have mechanisms, international mechanisms, and laws, and international law, and the rule of law, and so on. Let us take it all with the humanity that it needs to be effective. Without humanity, I think that we're lost. At least our case is lost. Oh, there you are.
And then we had one other over here.
Thank you so much for everything you are doing. It's really amazing. So, as you said earlier, my question is based on the UN. As you said earlier, the foundation of the UN, those 5 countries that won the war and that have been in the Security Council. And as you said also earlier, UN is not very popular here in the USA because it's not touching the life of others compared to other countries. So my question are, someone also from that countries, I think you also touch a lot of my life, so I know a lot. But I have a different opinion, right? Based on the institution of the UN. I'm not sure about many others, but who feel institution of the UN are, let's say, great or excellent? Let me just say the hands.
Okay, some half of. Oh, huh, that's interesting.
People were taking note.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay, someone like me, I feel like the UN institution. I'm sorry to say that. UN is a very good vision organization that includes all of us, bring everyone out of the planet together and try to solve and put the peace and the security and have the strong institution. But some of us feels like UN institution, it's more for the weaker. The bigger one use it for their favor, on their favor toward the weaker one. So my question is, where do you see maybe 50 years from now, where do you see the future of the UN?
Can we get the other question and then maybe answer both of them? I think we'll...
I don't. My brain doesn't work like that, but I will get the question. I promise. Let me answer.
Okay.
Do you want to moderate?
Ah.
No. But at least until the 30th of April of 2046, when I retire. I hope it's a run. Okay. Let's just do that. But I think the future of the UN is bright. And it has a brilliant future because we are learning, and we have learned in 77 years, that is by partnering with external actors that we really accomplish things. Let me tell you one secret, and Ryan hears me saying this all the time. The UN is as useless or as useful as member states allow us to be. We rely heavily on the willingness of 193 member states to make good use of this instrument we call the United Nations. The UN doesn't have an independence that allows for it to just make decisions, say, hey, now we're going to do this. We rely heavily on the willingness of those member states to really accomplish something. So how do we change that? By engaging youth and all population so that they can vote for the right people who have the right ideals that then will support ideas of the UN, and we can accomplish much. I will use the example of Israel and Palestine. Do I think that we will get peace there? Yes. Why? Because one day we'll have two great leaders that will be born and will be elected and will be representing both sides, and we'll see, you know what? People come first, not politics. So let's work on this together. We have seen that happen in the past. I know that it will happen. And I know that the UN will be the convening place. Rob Skinner said before this morning, the UN, if there's one thing that the UN can do, is convene people. We can bring enemies, we can bring allies and foes and everyone in between, and we can have them have a conversation. We can help them have the conversation. We can mediate. This reconciliation business I told you, how do you bring people who are perpetrators of crime and victims of crime? By bringing them together to the table and talking and listening to each other and seeing why. I can tell you, I don't justify the invasion of Russia of Ukraine, but I can explain why it happens. An explanation is necessary to understand what happens, why we are where we are, and what the solutions could be. So I'm not justifying what happened, but we need explanations of why. This conversation, that is what the UN does. We convene people to have explanations, to learn more, and then hopefully plan for the future. And I think that we have a bright future at the UN when everyone is involved, and that's what we bring the UN to people to say, okay, can we really engage? Can we really partner? Let me tell you a secret. The UN, you know this very well, the UN needs you way more than you need the UN. There's only 35,000 of us working for the Secretariat. There's almost 8 billion people on this planet. The math doesn't add up unless you're engaged. So you want to do it that is effective? Help us.
May I, Felipe?
Yeah, please.
So the biggest criticism of the UN is that the UN doesn't do anything, right? That the UN is just a bunch of talk. But the thing is, the member states are the ones that have to actually commit. So the UN doesn't have a standing army. They don't have a standing peacekeeping force. If they're going to send in a peacekeeping force somewhere, it's because Uruguay says, well, I'm going to send my 10,000 troops, and Sudan says, well, I'm going to send 5, or whatever it is, right? It's not UN troops. It's individual countries committing to that initiative. And the talk at the UN is highly, highly important because that talk leads to agreed upon language, which leads to national legislation, which leads to local legislations, and it trickles down, right? And I think as more and more people understand how that talk affects their daily lives, that the UN will just grow stronger and stronger.
Thank you. There was a question.
Hi, okay, my name is Michelle and I'm from the University of Westminster in London. So my question concerns pretty much justice. You talked about the death penalty. So I was wondering, as a total outsider, because I was born and raised in Italy, it used to be a main concern in the 18th century. So all over Europe, every philosopher expressed their own opinions about that. And so basically my question is, I'd like to think that as a society we kind of evolved. So why do you think it's still so relevant and also embraced and tolerated nowadays?
It's a great question. It's a really tough one. If I fully understood it, I think we wouldn't be here today. But I do think that there are a couple of things that come to mind. I think the death penalty is, unfortunately, just a very, very good example of the flaws in the American criminal justice system. It's just, you know, we see the same flaws across this justice system. And so why does our criminal justice system look the way that it does? It's very punitive. It is very discriminatory. It targets black and brown people and not white people who look like me, and so on. We all know this to be true. I think the biggest reason, if I were to point to one, probably is to the idea of fear and this idea of a bad guy or girl, if you will. I think that even right now, there's sort of a wave of fear around the idea of tough on crime. And if you see, you know, crime or violence rising, you want to point a finger and say, there's a reason for it. And I think that despite the fact that I agree with you that we're in the 21st century and there are so many deep flaws with the death penalty, I think a lot of people want to be able to put that away, far, far away, out of sight, out of mind, and be able to say, you know, crime can be solved if we can sort of put the bad people away. I, of course, do not agree with that, but if I were to point to sort of one area, I think it's that idea of fear and that idea of wanting to put people away so that they don't sort of impact the rest of society. Again, I think that's a deeply flawed logic.
Thank you. We have 2 more minutes.
So I know we're almost done, so if each of the panelists could just take 30 seconds to answer my question, I'd really appreciate it. I'd like to focus on the first of the 3 things discussed today, peace. And I know that we're talking about institutions, but personally and individually, I just want to ask the panelists, how do you practice promoting peace as an individual? And what would you say we could do as individuals to also promote peace?
Thank you. Jensen Lambert.
So I'll go first on that one. Obviously, as an educator, I educate people with the intention of making them activists as much as myself as an activist. A few years ago, I would have probably said I was a critical criminologist because I went, the system's broken. My view now as an activist criminologist is that the system's broken, what are we going to do about it? So I think for me, as an activist criminologist, it's to educate others to take action themselves and to give them the skills and confidence to do that.
I would say, in terms of my work, I see peace and justice as hand in hand. And I think that when I try to talk to businesses, even folks who I think are very different from me when they leave their office, I try to see the peace in them, if you will, and try to find that shared humanity of why they might want to help support a particular policy that I think will make the world a better place. And in terms of my personal sort of way that I hope to bring more peace to the world, I try to be a really good neighbor. I think that the most localized version of bringing peace is either within yourself or within your community. And I think that I live in New York City, actually. I live in Brooklyn. I live in a brownstone. I share a very, very small space with a lot of people. And I try to make that feel good for everybody.
So I alluded to it before, but maybe articulated a little bit better, is to assume good intentions from everybody. Whether it's somebody that you're working with professionally that thinks differently than you do, or somebody that cuts you off in traffic, to assume good intentions. Whenever I get cut off in traffic, I tell my wife, they're just rushing to the hospital because their wife's in labor, right? Like assume a good intention, and you'll notice that you feel better about the world, and if everybody gave each other that same grace, then I think the world would look very differently.
In the last few seconds, but thank you. It depends on what you define for peace, and peace, as I said at the beginning, is more than just peace around us, just like lack of conflict. I think quality of life. So long as we serve other people, and that's a principle that we practice in our faith tradition, but also we should practice in society, in our backgrounds, in anything that we do. We need to be builders of communities that really care for people, that have people at the center of it. Our decisions should be made on what is the benefit for everyone in this. How can I put others before myself in this case, without forgetting about that I'm important to, and contribute to the conversation by bringing, I said this before, listen to people before you speak. Empathize by understanding others. I think that building a peace is really understanding humanity, and understanding humanity is just not assuming, but just, again, embracing the reality and enjoying diversity. That's a cool thing. I mean, come on. We need to be diverse. We need to be different, and that is the beauty of it. And there's, I mean, you come to Utah and you see all this conference, for example. Look around. It's amazing how many people come from different places. Get to know each other. Just, I don't know, be nice. It's not that hard. And it's super, super good. Trust me, you sleep very well at night when you do this. This is the best mantra ever. But truly, think about people at the center of everything. And when you do that and you leave no one behind, UN agenda, but when you leave no one, when you really embrace all this, is when you will contribute to peace. Thank you to the panel. You've been amazing. Thank you to everyone. I mean, a round of applause for them. And now, we set you free. Go and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Pleasure. Great to meet you. Yeah. See you in New York sometime.
Pleasure.